Saturday night. Brussels is asleep, but inside a nondescript office building in the town of La Hulpe, just outside the city, a small group of executives are staring at a message from four governments at once: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the European Union. The message is simple: cut them off. Them is 7 Russian banks, and the organization being asked to cut them off isn't a government agency. It isn't a military body. It's a private, member-owned Belgian cooperative that most people outside of banking have never heard of: SWIFT. Within days, those 7 banks would be unable to send or receive a single international payment, not because their money disappeared, not because their vaults were empty, but because the invisible messaging network that tells banks, send this money to this account at this bank, had simply stopped listening to them. This is the story of how a quiet, back-office plumbing system for banks became one of the most feared weapons in modern geopolitics, and how the United States, without ever fully owning it, learned to bend it to its will. Part 1. The problem SWIFT was built to solve. To understand how SWIFT became a weapon, you first have to understand why it was built, and it wasn't built by America at all. It was built, in part, to escape America. By the late 1960s, international banking had a serious problem. Cross-border payments between banks were being sent over telex, a decades-old technology, essentially a glorified typewriter connected by telephone wire. Every payment instruction had to be typed out in free-form text, in whatever format the sending bank happened to use. There was no standardization. A single mistyped account number, a misread currency code, an ambiguous abbreviation, and millions of dollars could vanish into the wrong account, or simply get stuck for weeks while clerks on both ends tried to figure out what the message actually meant. But there was a second, quieter problem, and this one was political. At the time, one American bank, First National City Bank of New York, the institution that would later become Citibank, was pushing its own proprietary messaging system as the industry standard. European and other American banks looked at this and felt a chill. If one single, fully American, privately owned bank controlled the pipes that international money moved through, that bank, and by extension, the United States, would have extraordinary leverage over every other bank on Earth. So in 1973, 239 banks from 15 countries did something about it. They formed a cooperative, not a company owned by shareholders chasing profit, but a member-owned utility, incorporated under Belgian law, headquartered in the small town of La Hulpe outside Brussels. They called it the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT. The idea was almost defiantly neutral. No single country and no single bank would own the pipes. The banks themselves, thousands of them, from every corner of the world, would own it collectively, and a coalition of the world's major central banks would oversee it, so that no single government could simply seize control. It took 4 years to build. In 1977, the network finally went live, with over 500 member banks in more than 15 countries. Slowly, painfully, telex was retired. SWIFT became the language banks spoke to each other in, a shared standardized format for sending payment instructions securely, quickly, and with dramatically fewer errors. By design, SWIFT does not move money. It has never held a single dollar, euro, or ruble. It is at its core a messaging system, the fax machine of global finance, not the vault. When your bank sends money overseas, the actual funds move through a web of correspondent banking relationships. SWIFT simply carries the instruction: send this amount to this account at this institution, through this route. But in modern finance, the instruction and the money have become almost inseparable. Without the message, the payment simply doesn't happen. And that distinction between the pipe and the water is exactly what would make SWIFT so valuable to a government looking for leverage decades later. Part 2. From Utility to Nervous System. Through the 1980s and 90s, SWIFT grew the way infrastructure often does: quietly, invisibly, and completely. In 1987, its membership expanded beyond simple bank-to-bank payments into securities and money markets. More countries joined. More types of institutions joined: brokers, custodians, fund managers, corporate treasuries. By the early 2000s, SWIFT was processing millions of messages a day, connecting thousands of institutions across 200 countries. Nobody planned for SWIFT to become the central nervous system of the global economy. It happened because it worked. It was reliable. It was secure. And crucially, it was standardized. Every bank everywhere spoke the same financial language over the same network. That kind of infrastructure doesn't get replaced once it reaches critical mass. It becomes load-bearing. Entire national payment systems, stock exchanges, and central banks built their operations assuming SWIFT would always be there, always working, always neutral. And for a long time, it was neutral, or at least, it tried very hard to appear that way. SWIFT's own governance was built specifically to prevent any single government from steering it. It is overseen not by Washington, but by a group of central banks from the G10 nations: Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States, with the National Bank of Belgium acting as lead overseer, because SWIFT is, on paper, a Belgian company governed by Belgian law. This detail matters enormously to the story, because it complicates the simple version of events. SWIFT is not an American company. It has never been owned by the American government. Legally, when the United States wants SWIFT to do something, it cannot simply order it to. It has to apply pressure, legislative, diplomatic, and financial, until either SWIFT's own board acts, or a body with actual legal authority over SWIFT, like the European Union, forces its hand. That distinction is the difference between owning a weapon outright and quietly, patiently building the influence to make someone else pull the trigger for you. And as the next 20 years would show, patience was something the United States had in abundance. Part 3. The Secret Program. The turning point came from tragedy, not ambition, at least not at first. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, the Bush administration launched a sweeping effort to trace the money behind terrorism. Deep inside the CIA, overseen by the Treasury Department, a program was born: the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, or TFTP. Its purpose was to subpoena vast amounts of financial message data from SWIFT, not just transactions tied to named suspects, but enormous bulk sets of records, and mine them for patterns that might reveal terrorist financing networks. For nearly 5 years, almost nobody outside a small circle of officials knew this program existed. SWIFT itself complied quietly, handing over data under legal subpoena, believing, or at least stating publicly, later, that it had received serious assurances about how narrowly that data would be used. Then in June 2006, 3 newspapers working independently, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times, broke the story open. The public learned, for the first time, that the United States government had been quietly tapping into the plumbing of the entire international banking system, headquartered not in Washington, but in Belgium, built by a coalition of nations specifically to avoid this kind of unilateral access. The reaction in Europe was furious. This wasn't just about terrorism anymore. It was about sovereignty. A European-Belgian company had allowed an American intelligence-adjacent program to access financial data belonging to European citizens and European banks, without European governments fully understanding the scale of what was happening. Belgium's own data protection authorities weighed in. The European Parliament held hearings. Years of negotiation followed, eventually producing a formal EU-US agreement, in effect from August 2010, laying out strict rules for how the Treasury could request SWIFT data, with SWIFT required to store certain categories of European data on servers physically located inside the European Union, no longer transferable by default to servers in the United States. The lesson the United States took from this wasn't back off. It was closer to the opposite. Swift data, and by extension, swift access, was one of the most powerful tools in Washington's financial arsenal. And unlike a missile or a soldier, it could be aimed at an enemy's economy without a single shot being fired. Part 4. The Iran Template. If the terrorist finance tracking program showed Washington what was possible by quietly reading SWIFT's data, the campaign against Iran showed the world what was possible by cutting a country off from SWIFT entirely. Iran's nuclear program had been the subject of international concern for years, and by the early 2010s, the United States and its allies wanted a way to pressure Tehran that stopped short of military conflict. In 2012, the U.S. Congress passed legislation authorizing the president to sanction any institution, including a financial messaging provider like SWIFT, that continued to serve Iran's central bank or other designated Iranian financial institutions. The message to SWIFT's leadership was blunt: keep serving sanctioned Iranian banks, and your own institution becomes a target of U.S. sanctions. But there was a second layer to this, and it's the layer that's often missed. SWIFT didn't ultimately act because Washington told it to. It acted because the European Union, which has actual regulatory authority over SWIFT as a Belgian company, passed its own regulation, EU Regulation 267 of 2012, formally prohibiting SWIFT from providing messaging services to EU-sanctioned Iranian banks. On March 15, 2012, SWIFT's then CEO, Lazaro Campos, made the announcement himself. SWIFT had been instructed to discontinue services to Iranian financial institutions under European sanction. He called it an extraordinary and unprecedented step. Days later, dozens of Iranian banks, including the Central Bank of Iran itself, went dark on the network. The effect was immediate and brutal. Cut off from SWIFT, Iran couldn't easily receive payment for oil exports, couldn't easily pay for imports, and watched its currency collapse. Economists studying the period estimated real private sector pay in Iran fell by 35 to 40%, and the country's GDP contracted by nearly 6% in 2012 alone. Then, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called it, at the time, a very effective way of further isolating Iran. In 2015, following the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, sanctions relief allowed most of those Iranian banks to reconnect to SWIFT in early 2016. But the reprieve didn't last. In May 2018, President Trump announced the United States was withdrawing from the nuclear deal entirely, and the Treasury Department once again warned SWIFT that continued service to Iranian banks would trigger American sanctions against SWIFT itself. By November 2018, the Central Bank of Iran and dozens of other institutions were disconnected for a second time. The first time in history, a country's central bank had been formally cut off from the network. Iran had become the proof of concept. The United States had shown twice that it didn't need to own SWIFT to control what SWIFT did. It only needed the ability to make staying connected to Iran more costly to SWIFT and its members than disconnecting from Iran. That's not ownership. That's leverage. And leverage, applied patiently and repeatedly, can look an awful lot like control. Part 5. Russia, the biggest test yet. Iran's economy, while significant, was a relatively contained test case. Russia would be something else entirely: the 11th largest economy in the world, a nuclear power, and a country whose banks were deeply woven into global trade, especially European energy markets. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, calls to remove Russia from SWIFT began almost immediately. Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, publicly demanded it within hours. But here the more complicated, less cinematic truth of the story reasserts itself. The EU was initially split. European banks held tens of billions of dollars in exposure to Russian institutions. Cutting Russia off from SWIFT risked cutting Europe off from being repaid on loans. And more urgently, risked disrupting the flow of Russian oil and gas that much of Europe still depended on to heat homes and run factories. The compromise that emerged, announced February 26th and formally implemented on March 2, 2022, was deliberately surgical. 7 Russian banks, including VTB Bank, Bank Otkritie, Novokombank, Promsvyazbank, Bank Rossiya, Sovcombank, and VEB, were named for disconnection, effective March 12. Notably absent from that list, Sberbank and Gazprombank, Russia's largest financial institutions, specifically exempted because they processed the payments for Russian oil and gas exports that Europe still relied on. Even in an act framed as economic warfare, energy dependency forced restraint. That restraint didn't last forever. Over the following months and years, the list of banned banks grew. By May 2022, Sberbank itself, along with Credit Bank of Moscow and the Russian Agricultural Bank, had been added to the exclusion list. And by July 2025, the European Union moved even further, converting the SWIFT ban on the remaining listed Russian and Belarusian banks into a full transaction ban, meaning EU institutions could no longer engage in any transaction with those banks, whether through SWIFT or otherwise. The impact on Russia was severe but not total. Deprived of SWIFT access, the affected banks lost the ability to easily obtain foreign currency or move assets abroad through the normal channels the rest of the world's banks use. But Russia was not without an escape route. Years earlier, following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the first wave of Western sanctions that followed, Russia had begun building its own alternative, SBFS, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, run by its own central bank. It was slower, far smaller, and lacked SWIFT's global reach, but it gave Russian banks somewhere to route at least domestic and some allied transactions. And crucially, Russia had a much larger partner waiting in the wings, China. Part 6. The World Builds and Exit. This is the part of the story that the "America weaponized the banks" headline often leaves out, the part where the rest of the world starts building the door marked exit. China had been developing its own cross-border payment infrastructure since 2015. CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, designed to let banks settle transactions in Chinese yuan without needing to route through SWIFT or the US dollar system at all. For years, CIPS remained a minor player, a backup system, mostly used for yuan-denominated trade. But when Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT in 2022, many of them turned to CIPS as one of the few remaining large-scale alternatives available to them, giving China's payment network a sudden and significant boost in relevance. Iran, for its part, had spent years exploring workarounds of its own, from barter-style trade arrangements with allied nations to public discussion, as early as 2018, about whether cryptocurrency could offer a way to settle international payments outside the dollar-based system altogether. None of these alternatives have come close to replacing SWIFT's scale. As of the mid-2020s, SWIFT still connects more than 11,000 institutions across over 200 countries and processes tens of millions of messages every single day. CIPS, by comparison, remains a fraction of that size, and is itself often still reliant on SWIFT's messaging standards to function properly. But scale isn't really the point anymore. The point is that every time SWIFT access has been used as a lever against a major economy, Iran, then Russia, the rest of the world hasn't quietly accepted its exposure. It has started building redundancy, insurance, an exit just in case it's needed next. That is arguably the single biggest long-term risk of using SWIFT this way at all. Every act of financial leverage against one country becomes a warning to every other country watching, and the nations most likely to be watching most closely, China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the members of BRICS, are exactly the nations whose continued participation in the dollar-based financial system the United States has the most to lose by alienating. Part 7. Who's really holding the strings? So let's return to the title of this video and be honest about the nuance inside it, because America weaponized Europe's banks is a powerful hook, but the real mechanics are more layered, and understanding that layering is the whole point of this story. SWIFT itself is not American. It is a Belgian cooperative owned by its member banks, governed under Belgian law, overseen day-to-day by the National Bank of Belgium, alongside a coalition of G10 central banks that includes the Federal Reserve, but also the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Bundesbank, and the European Central Bank, among others. When Iran was disconnected in 2012, the legal trigger wasn't an American order. It was an EU regulation, because the EU has actual jurisdiction over a Belgian company in a way the United States does not. But here's where America weaponized it, earns its place in the title anyway. The United States doesn't need direct legal control over SWIFT, because it controls something SWIFT's own members can't function without: access to the US dollar and the American banking system. Any major bank disconnected from SWIFT, or found helping a sanctioned entity route around a SWIFT ban, risks something far more existential than losing a messaging subscription: losing its own access to US dollar clearing, and therefore losing its ability to do business with virtually every other major bank on Earth. That threat, not a direct order to SWIFT's Brussels headquarters, is the real lever. Washington doesn't have to hold the gun. It just has to make sure everyone else understands what happens if they don't pull the trigger themselves. That's the silent part of the weaponization. It doesn't look like an invasion. It doesn't look like a declaration. It looks like a subpoena in 2001, a piece of legislation in 2012, a phone call to European finance ministers in 2022, each individually defensible, each on its own framed as a response to terrorism or nuclear proliferation or a war of aggression. But stacked together across 2 decades, they reveal something else: a pattern of the United States learning, case by case, exactly how much pressure it takes to turn a neutral Belgian cooperative, built specifically to prevent any one nation from controlling global finance, into an instrument it can reliably point at whichever country it decides is the problem.